But remember that there is what I call the scramble for Africa. Remember also that Nigeria is a regional power. Remember also that there is another power called France, which is desperate, losing her territories, as it were. In the mind of France, a little later, but if I was to be asked in a nutshell, why is it that coup d'etats are now becoming the way of solving problems, particularly in what sometimes is referred to as Francophone Africa? The answer is simple. You know, the country that is now known as Benin must be understood in its historical context. Benin regained or gained our independence in the year 1960, and it was then known as Dahomey. And when it gained independence, there were very interesting things that happened at that time. The leading politician, of course, was Hubert Maga. And the politics of Dahomey, as it was then known, was very ethnic. Hubert Maga was supported by an ethnic group called the Bariba. The other person that was a major player was Apiti, who was supported by the Yoruba. The third politician was, of course, Justin Timoten, who was supported by the Faun and the Gaun. And that is why they were called the Triumvirate. But no sooner had Dahomey gained independence in 1960 than there was a coup in 1963. The coup was led by Soglo, who later, of course, entered into an alliance with Apiti and Timoten and formed or continued the Triumvirate. In 1963. In 1965, Soglo himself now took power and did reign as the president of Dahomey for quite some time, until 1972, when there was yet another coup by Matthews Kereko. Kereko was very interesting because while Benin was, or Dahomey then, was a French colony, and seen as one of the more important, small but important to the French at that time, he declared himself a Marxist-Leninist and created a single-party state at that time. And Matthews Kereko became very famous as one of these leaders who was moving towards creating a totally different scenario in a country that had been beholden to the French. And it is him who in 1975 changed the name of the country from Dahomey to Benin. And when that happened, of course, the entire process continued, and during the difficult periods of the Cold War, remember, he takes power in 1972-75, the name is changed to Dahomey, and he remains in power until the period that is the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. During that meeting held in the month of February 1990, he is stripped of his powers, and Benin becomes one of the very first countries to have multi-party politics in the post-Cold War era. And that is when, therefore, we have an election, and during that election we have Boni Yayi. I think it's in the year 2006 that you had Boni Yayi elected as the president. Benin is now seen as a democracy, but with a very disturbed history of many coups d'etats. In the year 2016, that is when we have the current president, Patrick Talon, that Patrick Talon himself was a very rich farmer, one of the richest cotton farmers in Benin. And he moves very quickly to consolidate the economy. Remember, it's one party, but he creates an environment where all arms of government are beholden to him. He increases the term of the parliamentarians from 5 to 7 years, but even the presidency to 7 years. But he remains, the term limits also remain. So Talon comes into power, as I've already indicated, in the year 2016. So that Talon is actually supposed to leave office in the month of April, the year 2026. When the elections are due, the presidential elections are due in April, the year 2026. The parliamentary elections in the month of January 2026, which then begs the question, when there is such a guarantee of exchange of power or change of power, why is a coup necessary, if at all? The reason is not far to seek. It is simple. Talon, despite his arguments to the contrary, is one of the people who is seen to be closer to the French administration of President Macron. Number two, all arms of government have now been emasculated. The legislature emasculated, the judiciary emasculated, private sector emasculated, and he's chosen here Romualdo Wadagni, the current finance minister, is the one who is designated as his successor. And knowing as we do, what happens in African elections is as good as the president if the elections were held. And what has happened, therefore, is that there are elements within the army who hold the view that the ballot cannot be trusted. And they are copying what we have seen happen in Guinea, in Mali, in Niger, and of course we have seen that also happening in Burkina Faso, happening in Guinea-Bissau, happening in Gabon. And that is the very reason why we had this coup or attempted coup that did not go too far. But the question is, why did the coup fail at all? Why did it not succeed? In my view, there are a number of reasons. Remember, very quickly, the Nigerians sent in their planes there. And that, in my view, was a show of force that we are prepared to intervene. Whether they are doing so as the lead power in the ECOWAS region is a debate that we'll hold. But there is also suggestion that President Macron held certain conversations, seeing Benin as one of the few countries that still remain under the control of France. They have lost everything. They only remain with Côte d'Ivoire. They remain with Togo. Gabon, I think they have gained, because what happened must have been a cosmetic coup, seeing the reception that Macron recently received in Libreville. So that is the context in which we must understand. So I think there are elements within the armed forces which are still animated by ethnicity and loyalty. Remember, as I said, in the very early days of Hubert Maga, the country was dictated by ethnic politics, as I've read. The Bariba are a major tribe there. The Yoruba are also quite prominent, and the Fon and the Gaun are also quite prominent. So within the armed forces, I suspect that those particular realities still play. And coupled with financial interests, coupled with foreign influence, these individuals could not just succeed. In fact, I asked myself, as I saw the coup unfolding, I was moving from channel to channel, trying to monitor what was happening. And I asked a friend of mine who was in Porto Novo, but have they held Patrick Talon? If they haven't held him, then there is no coup. Because the very first thing that people do when they hold try a coup d'etat, you make sure you have the leader or you are in control. But they did not. And that is why we were seeing gunfire around the presidential palace. And after that, it was neutralized. The details, of course, will come out a little later. But if I was to be asked in a nutshell, why is it that coup d'etats are now becoming the way of solving problems, particularly in what sometimes is referred to as Francophone Africa? The answer is simple. Many of these countries in the so-called Francophone Africa are controlled from Paris. People can pretty much predict what is going to happen. People are getting tired, they are getting poorer, their leaders are getting richer. And the people in the military are now seeing themselves as the saviors because the ballot has failed. And that is the context in which what happened in Benin happened. Of course, I know there will be attempts at sending a very clear message by punishing the coup, those who attempted the coup. But let us not speculate. Let us wait and see. Remember that ECOWAS has found itself in a very difficult situation in the recent past. They have found themselves in a difficult situation in the cases of the coups that we know about in Guinea, in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina, and of course recently in Guinea-Bissau. And what they have done very quickly without much thought and assessment, in my view, is to say, we are not going to cooperate with you. And how did the Sahelian countries respond? They responded by saying, we are withdrawing from ECOWAS, and they did in the month of January this year. Burkina withdrew, Mali withdrew, and Niger withdrew. And initially what they tried to do, particularly in the case of Niger, was to threaten military action. And they are now coming out very firmly because they fear that if this trend continues, and it may very well continue, then ECOWAS will have very few members, because these countries that are going through these processes will then want to join what they are considering to be a more progressive alliance, which is being created in the Sahel. So ECOWAS is trying to redeem itself by saying we must do something. And you could see that this is much more reminiscent of what they did in the case of Yahya Jammeh in the Gambia. And Nigeria perhaps is a little bit more concerned this time round because this is too close to home. So that you have a situation where in the north you have Niger, and you are now beginning to have attempts which are too close to home. And I think people are getting worried, even in spaces such as Nigeria, because coup d'etats are sometimes copycat. People see it has happened there. The ballot is not working. Why don't we save the people? So they are the latter-day saviors. So we see an attempt at redemption by the ECOWAS group, led as it must be by Nigeria. You know, of course, there are no exact answers because this is not an exact science. But remember that there is what I call the scramble for Africa. Remember also that Nigeria is a regional power. Remember also that there is another power called France, which is desperate, losing her territories, as it were. In the mind of France, countries such as Benin are what they used to call during the colonial period the territoire d'outre-mer. These are the external territories. And that mindset is still alive and well. So Nigeria, in some ways, may be lending itself to being used to stop these coups, to stop what they call, what the African Union has characterized as unconstitutional changes of power, and therefore contrary to the Malabo Declaration on unconstitutional changes of power. Of course, that does not mean that there are no domestic problems within Nigeria. They are numerous. We've seen quite a number of abductions and kidnappings in different states of Nigeria, such as Kebbi, Borno, Kwara State. So some are saying, and I've had some friends of mine from Benin say they should leave us alone. But remember, Benin is very small, and for that reason, it can very easily be decimated by Nigeria. And those are realities that you cannot rule out. You know, I sometimes, it's very interesting. France is a unique colonizer. It is unique in the sense that it is one that from an analyst's perspective has been rejected the most by its former colonizers. And that rejection has economic implications. So that when we see the desperation, it is because of economic reasons. If recent reports are true in Burkina Faso, they are trying to seize or take by some compensation the assets of Total Energies. So if you get into a space like Benin, which has a major seaport in Porto Novo, you are finding yourself as France in a situation where your space is becoming smaller and smaller. I do not know whether Macron has confirmed or denied that there was a phone call, but be that as it may, I think there was some communication. Whether it's a phone call or not, we do not know, but some communication is going on. And this is the case of a leader and a European power that is losing ground on a daily basis. Losing ground, and its economic territory is disappearing. It is not only in Benin. They are struggling in Algeria. They are struggling in the Sahel. And they are struggling even in Europe, where they want to be a power. They are struggling. So Macron's behavior must be seen in the context of a power whose fortunes are dwindling, and therefore is becoming more and more desperate. And in that desperation, they will want to ensure that they retain such territories as they consider susceptible to their manipulation, and individuals whom they think are still beholden to them. We have seen that in the case of Ouattara in La Côte d'Ivoire, and we are now seeing that in the case of Patrice Talon in Benin. So that is a desperate France. And I think, I may be wrong, but I believe that they are going to be the chair of the G7 very soon. And they don't want to get into that space with their wings clipped, and they are being clipped on a daily basis. Because as a result of this attempted coup, Benin will never be the same again. Because there is definitely going to be a purge of of the attempted coup makers. And you will have this purge so close to January, when you have your legislative election, so close to the presidential elections, which are due in the month of April, with an opposition which I believe will now be much more revived. And that opposition is not going to look to France. It is going to look to Burkina Faso, is going to look to Niger, is going to look to Mali, is going to look to Guinea. And France is desperate. Macron is desperate. Remember, even Nigeria itself is due for an election in the year 2027. And there are many internal contradictions which will not make Nigeria available to do the bidding of others. It will be focusing a lot more on their own internal circumstances. You've seen very recently the Nigerian president has had to replace his minister for defense, which means that there are domestic issues which are going to preoccupy Nigeria. So the desperation of Macron is understandable. It's colonial hangover. And colonial hangover stays on for rather long. There are many things. When you listen to analysts, particularly when you listen to major European and American outlets, there is this cry that Russia is becoming more and more prominent in the continent of Africa, that they are present in Burkina Faso, they are present in Mali, they are present in Niger, much more prominent in Central African Republic. and that for that reason, there is reason to suspect that the Russian hand is the invisible hand in these coups. But I think that I don't take away the fact that Russia may have an interest as a world power that is trying to establish itself or re-establish itself, that it may have some kind of silent interest. But I think that that is not the exact case. People are tired. When you travel to many African countries, and I do, the population is tired. People are becoming poorer and poorer. The politicians are becoming richer and richer and becoming more and more arrogant, because the ballot is no longer an avenue that can guarantee genuine change. And for that reason, the voter apathy in many countries is a statement of the fact that we are tired and we do not know what to do. And the military, which is a part of the society, is receiving that message and interpreting it to mean that it is only we who are more organized. It is only we who have the power of the gun, who can disrupt this corrupt and arrogant politicians. And in the early days, they are therefore coming in their mind as saviors. Whether they'll remain in that position for a long time, nobody knows, because the history of coup makers also is that sooner rather than later, they discard their uniform and wear suits, and they themselves repeat the same mistakes made by their predecessors. But in the short to medium term, I think it is these internal realities that is influencing these changes. How does a country like Russia or China then benefit? They benefit because when coups are successful, you don't look to your former master, you look to new friends. And it is in that context that you can see in countries where there have been coup d'etats, the leaders are warming up to Russia. The leaders are warming up to China. The leaders are warming up to Turkey, because they think these are new friends without baggage. The other thing why they are warming up to Russia and China is because they have no colonial history, so that their relationship can be given the benefit of doubt. But if you look at the former colonizers like France, they have a colonial history. The relationship has been abusive and parasitic, and we see countries that are tired. People have been asking for apology for colonization. People have been asking for reparation for slavery and colonization, and they don't even want to apologize. So people are saying good riddance. And it is in that context that these accusations are then coming out. Remember that politics is also driven by propaganda. And in the world of propaganda, as the cliche now goes, the truth takes the stairs, lies take the elevator. You know, what one sees and what one saw in the first few hours of that coup was the face of young Beninois. It is a statement with several nuances and which can be interpreted very differently. One, young people, wherever they are saying, our countries are being messed up by individuals who happen to be old, who happen to be entitled, who happen to think that they are larger than life, almost as large as death, who also happen to be corrupt, who also think that they can manipulate the population and stay in power for as long as they can. And these young people are coming up with what they consider to be fresh breath of air. And they are looking at what is happening in the neighborhood, which people are praising. They are looking at what is happening in the early days in Burkina, in Niger, in Mali, And they are saying this is where we want to take our countries because our countries are young. The average age in many African countries is between 19 and 22. They want to be present at the table where decisions are being made. They are also telling the world this thing that you call democracy, which has been sold to us by the West particularly, is no longer working. They are saying we need to interrupt this thing so that Africans can engage and countries can engage and rethink and reimagine governance in a way that will respond to the realities of different African countries. You can see their conviction. You could see their courage. You could see the spirit of wanting to bring in something new. It is unfortunate that it has to happen in that way, that it has to be that there must be coup d'etats. It is unfortunate. Everybody who is sensible would want a change of power, which is informed by people involvement. The coup d'etat is the language that is spoken by the unheard.
We must never stop the